この思いを消してしまうにはまだ人生長いでしょう。やり残してることをやり直してみたいから夢の続き追いかけていたはずなのに曲がりくねった細い道一につまずくあの頃みたいにって戻りたいわけじゃないのなくしてきた空を探してる分かってくれますように犠牲になったような悲しい顔はやめてよ罪の最後は涙じゃないよずっと苦しく背負ってくんだ出口見えない感情迷路に誰を待ってるの白いノートに綴ったようにもっと素直に吐き出したいよ何から逃れたいんだ現実ってやつかないために生きてるんだって叫びたくなるよ聞こえていますか無難になんてやってられないから帰る場所もないの優しさにはいつも感謝してるだから強くなりたい懐かしくなるこんな痛みも歓迎じゃん
Welcome back to A Dive in the Lore, my series on the lore of your favorite fantasy games. This time, once again, we'll be talking about the Korean MMORPG Mabinogi, where today we'll finally be looking into Generation 9 Alchemist. Settle in, grab a drink, grab a snack, and try to prepare for some angst as we begin Chapter 3. Generation 9 kicks off dramatically as we receive a vision of Adniel. The wings of a dead bird shall begin fluttering, and the light will be consumed by darkness. You are bound to the soul stream by destiny. You must enter the Shadow Realm and prevent the soul stream's destruction. Coincidentally, we also have Mail, a summons from Fallon, who is apparently the leader of Aliek's expeditionary force for the Shadow Realm. Though, Granite will mention that he's only ever dealt with Andrus and doesn't get Fallon, declining further comments in fear of sounding a little bit racist. This is foreshadowing. Double foreshadowing, even. Instead of immediately responding to the very important message we have received, we instead go and talk to the townsfolk, starting with Brenda. We're assured that everyone in the whole world definitely knows who Fallon is, and that he fought alongside Lu in the Battle of Moitara. Next, we move to the local priest, Colin, an NPC that we'll be seeing much more of. He explains to us that Teltown is the most heavily impacted by the politics of Tara thanks to the close proximity, and that the royal regime and the pontiff's court are experiencing some friction due to the state's acceptance of alchemy. Last but not least, we meet the head alchemist of Teltown, an elderly woman named Doran. She complains about the garrisons of elves and giants that have arrived to town after the discovery of the Shadow Realm, angry that the city continues to be a military fort for Tara instead of blossoming into a center for alchemy. She then says she believes that Fallon is out on a mission. At long last, we go and speak with General Andrus, who has assumed command in Fallon's absence. She explains that Fallon had become a war hero by defending Tara from a last-ditch Fomorian invasion after Balor Evil Eye was slain. She gives us an item that will allow us to go witness the event firsthand. What we see is Fallon holding a defensive line against some goblins before eventually being overrun. When the moment looks dire, however, Lu arrives with reinforcements. Lu's horse rears and he strikes a pose, and with that, the vision fades. We now return to Andrus, who decides that she needs to test the person who saved the goddess, became the successor to Lu, saved Eren from Krumkura, vanquished the Red Dragon Krumena, and was chosen as the conductor for the Gold Dragon by having them kill some pigs and some puppies. I'm not kidding. We comply, because we must, and so we prove ourselves worthy. This feels like having a doctorate in astrophysics but being asked by the hiring manager at McDonald's to do basic math, just to prove you're smart enough to work there. She hands us a second memorial item, and we head back to the Shadow Realm to watch the memories of a pair of alchemists, Lemur and Kai. The pair are Doran's students and members of the Royal Alchemy Society. They babble a little about how they're on a mission from the king, but eventually stumble upon our old friend, Gloskibnan, this time reborn from an alchemical transmutation. At this point, I feel like I need to just step in and say, sorry, some of this generation is just gonna be like that. We report what we saw to Andrus, and she briefly explains that Gloss is a god of destruction that was used by the Fomorians during the Battle of Moitur. This doesn't really jive with the lore from Generation 1, but it does become relevant later. She mentions that Fallon previously fought Gloss and received chronic injuries that still bother him to this day. Neat. She then requests that we take some supplies to Fallon inside the Shadow Realm, and so we head back to the altar. On arrival, we see Gloss yet again, and our character will consider fleeing from the monster. Thankfully, we're saved from the thing we've killed before by Fallon, who has his troops set up ice mines. The mines dispatched this incarnation of Gloss easily, so apparently it was even weaker than the original. Fallon introduces himself, explaining that the Fomors have broadly taken over the Shadow Realm and that the realm continues to expand. This expansion isn't explained beyond being a bad thing that endangers the regular world of Eren, as well as the Soul Stream. We head back to the real Telltown and are tasked with making more ice mines and bringing them back to Fallon. However, by the time we return, Fallon's unit has been thoroughly destroyed, with dead or dying soldiers scattered about. Notably, Fallon's corpse isn't anywhere to be seen. Instead, we find a girl, Jenna. We help her fend off a new wave of Fomorian attackers, and she vanishes in the scuffle. We return to General Andrus, who is shocked by the news of Fallon's defeat, as his forces were the main military power of the Expeditionary Force. Upon hearing our mention to Jenna, she grows even more worried, mentioning that the girl is somehow involved with the disappearance of Lemur and Kai and is a known Temple Knight. The General then assigns us to investigate this knightly order. We now do what we do best, asking common citizens about things they definitely won't know until we stumble our way into success. We start with Colin, the priest who actually definitely knows something but plays dumb. Then we talk to random people until we chat with Pierrick, who was once a traveling merchant. He points us to Lucas and Avonmaka, mentioning that he'd heard of the Temple Knights from him before. We now go into Bonrua, the nightclub ran by Lucas. He's willing to tell you what he knows, but only if we do him a favor first. He asks that we go deal with some kobold bandits, since they've been a nuisance to his operation. I think it's a shame that we never really get to see how deeply entrenched this character is in the underworld, because he essentially acts as like a mob boss here. Once we've done his dirty work, he tells us what he knows, essentially that they hired him as a transporter, having him deliver goods and people to specific locations, and that he had found that they were a militant branch of the Pontiff's court. Conveniently, he has been to their HQ before and even has an entry item to get you inside. Not terribly tight security for a group that is as strictly confidential as he makes them sound, but hey, whatever. We break into their base, leaving a trail of death and destruction in our wake until we find the boss room, where we try to remain stealthy for whatever reason. We see Jenna in prison, but are spotted by a guard, and we fight our way through to free her. She thanks us and explains that she had once been a Temple Knight, and had even been tasked with the assassination of Lemur. Instead of explaining herself like a normal human being, however, she then gives us yet another memorial item. I guess it sort of makes sense. It might be harder to lie like this, but this gimmick is definitely getting a little bit tired. We return to the Shadow Realm altar and offer up the necklace she had given us and see her speaking with Colin about her plans to leave the Temple Knights. Reporting back to Andrus, she says she doubts this information is really enough to prove Jenna innocent, but says that she will investigate. She then tells us that she's discovered that one of the alchemists we're looking for, Kai, had been an aspiring druid before becoming Doran's student. She sends us to Burkhead to see if he knows anything about his old student's whereabouts. Burkhead doesn't have any specifically useful information, simply explaining his late daughter and Kai had been in love, and that he believes Kai abandoned becoming a druid due to her passing. He then points us to a figure he calls the Shadow Walker. Ominous. We enter the Shadow Realm and find ourselves in Abney. We fight our way through some monsters and harvest Arad berries. If you're playing along to this, you specifically need red ones, so keep that in mind. Upon eating the berry, the screen goes trippy, but we can see a man overlooking the still water of the lake. Upon talking to him, he introduces himself as Elah, the Shadow Walker. Elah says he has seen the alchemist pursuing the Caliburn, which he describes as the Urg of Darkness. He seems to find the human use of the Caliburn amusing, as he muses about how it once belonged to the Fomor and was stolen by humans to create alchemy. With that, he fades into the shadows and leaves us gazing out at the lake alone. We return to Burkhead, who explains that he found Elah one day, injured and mentally broken. He initially doubted the Incubus would ever recover, but with his assistance, Elah did eventually heal. He gives you, you'll never guess, another memorial item, this one containing Elah's traumatic memories. How did they even make these things? Do you keep the memories? Is it easy? There's a lot of them, so it feels like it must be easy. Anyway, we go relive Elah's PTSD memories and see him and another Incubus, Lebeus, talking. Lebeus hints that Elah isn't actually an Incubus, which I'm not sure how that works, but the dude is pretty angry. The game doesn't actually explain why. Elah talks about destiny because this is fantasy Star Wars now, and Lebeus gets edgy, talking about how incubusi, are incomplete beings with no destiny. The two fight, Lebeus dies, and apparently it's all very traumatic. I wish the game would establish these characters better so I could care. The quest ends, and apparently the game doesn't care much either because we get a totally new, unrelated quest. We are sent to speak with the leader of the Elven Expeditionary Force, Granite. He explains that exposure to the Shadow Realm causes some elves to experience symptoms not too different from transforming into a desert ghost. He sends us to Doran to see if she has any insight as to why this happens. Doran, being the helpful old lady she is, says, "Yo, sorry bro, not really familiar with elves, sucks for them. Anyway, there's like a ton of Urg. It's probably from a huge transmutation, can probably only happen in the Shadow Realm, maybe, I don't know. Here's a sundial, it's a sundial of darkness. Yes, that does make no sense. Quit asking questions, go do a fetch quest." And so we go do the fetch quest. We gather 8 bits of junk and shove them all into the book we were given for the fetch quest and return to Andrus. We find out the bits of junk have something to do with Clive Solus. Andrus recollects that Fallon had a book about Clive and asks us to come back later. When later finally comes, she explains that the Clive Solus was the spirit weapon and sword of the late king of the gods, Nuwa. The sword was apparently destroyed in the battle, and Andrus isn't sure why the Fomorians would want to recreate it. We head back into the Shadow Realm and encounter Lemore, who is being escorted by a detachment of Fomorians. He tells the group to stop, claiming that this location is where he will, quote, confirm the Urg. We do what we do best and immediately fail at stealth, and Lemore turns against his captors as you fight them. He hurriedly explains that he didn't want to side with the Fomors and gives you a ring torque. Before you leave, you fight another small horde of Fomors until you encounter Tethra. Tethra talks about how you people are pretty racist and always resort to violence, while resorting to violence and grouping in the Milesian and the Tuatha Dé. Anyways, you beat him up, and when he loses, he calls you weak and gives you the bad suck. Things look dire until Fallon comes and saves you. Upon waking up outside the Shadow Realm, we talk to Doran. Doran explains that the torque you were given holds a message, and that she could tell who made it at a glance. She extracts the message hidden inside the item, Noatar Arat, which Doran explains means complete darkness to alchemists. She further elaborates that Urg comes from the light of Aaron's sun, and that similarly, Dark Urg comes from the dark sun of the Noatar Arat, which is the energy that alchemy functions with. She then sends us back to Burkhead to learn more about Clive Solus and the Shadow Realm. Burkhead explains that perhaps due to all the Fomorian blood it shed during the Second Battle of Moytara, Clive was in some way changed and became a passage into Noatar Arat, and allowed Dark Urg to begin to flood into Aaron. Apparently this didn't last very long because Crumcruaw swallowed the sword, sealing the hole open between Aaron and the Dark Dimension. He theorizes that the reason alchemy has blossomed is due to humanity coming to desire this dark power. With his lecture done, we go back to Andrus. She's concerned about the loss of Fallon's forces and is looking for a way to unite the Elven and Giant expeditionary forces to make up for the loss of manpower. She's heard rumors that the Heart of Korkul may be in the Shadow Realm and sends us off to find it to use as leverage. Once we find it, we show our evidence to the leaders of the two forces and convince them to commit. With our new allies in tow, we re-enter the Shadow Realm and face off against yet another Glosk of Nan. Once we succeed, we are approached by Tiamat, who applauds us for growing so strong so quickly. He uses a power that messes with our senses, which in reality just inverts our controls. Once we spank him silly, he does the thing every mobby villain and child does when they lose, and comes up with a brand new power. Thankfully, before he can unleash his ultra super mega attack that insta-kills even through invincibility shields or whatever, Kai shows up. Tiamat smugs at him about betraying Lemore, to which Kai responds by giving him the bad suck. Kai then explains to us that he betrayed Lemore, who he considers his dearest friend, because he had hoped that he could learn from the Fomorians how to resurrect Lena, his lost love. We receive word from Colin that he needs our help, and so we leave back to Telltown. Colin explains to us that he's concerned over Jenna, who despite not being fully healed from her injuries has left to find Lemore in the Shadow Realm. We briefly see Jenna and Lemore arguing. Lemore is about to re-enter the Shadow Realms in hopes of helping Kai, and a worried Jenna is trying to convince him that he should not risk his life for someone who had betrayed him. Lemore stands his ground and then enters the altar. We chase after the pair and find Jenna fighting against the Fomors alone. Naturally, we help her fend them off, but she's exhausted and not holding out well. She's nearly ran through by a spear-wielding Fomor, but is saved as Andras arrives with reinforcements. The newly united Expeditionary Force makes short work of the Fomorians, but the group's celebration is cut short by the appearance of the Heart of Korkul. The elves and giants are confused as to why the Fomorians have the relic, and we step forward to investigate. The relic sends us to Renaz, and we have an audience with the Golden Dragon, Adniel. For more information on him, please check out my Generation 8 video. He explains that we have been drawn to Renaz by destiny, and that we must intervene to stop the transmutation of Clive Solis, which would reopen the hole between Eren and Noatar Arat. He gives you a bugle as a symbol of your bond with him, and you return to Telltown to speak with Burkhead once again. We catch Burkhead up on the conversation with Adniel, and he gives us the Shadow Mirror, warning us that the transmutation of Clive may be close at hand, and that the mirror will allow us to enter the Shadow Realm and meet up with the Expeditionary Force. We briefly see a vision of Kai, who encounters Fallon. Fallon is a bad guy. Who would have ever guessed? Fallon explains that by the time he met Lu had already fallen to become the Dark Lord, who convinced him to follow the ideology of the Fomor. Once we entered the Shadow Realm ourselves, we help the Expeditionary Force hold off a few waves of Fomorians until Andras, Karpfen, and Granite arrive as reinforcements. We peel off to stop the transmutation, but bump into Tethra. With Jenna and Lemur's assistance, we beat Tethra stupid. Lemur and Jenna stay behind to buy us time as we go to save Kai. We storm the transmutation site, apparently putting a stop to the experiment, however Fallon approaches. Fallon complains about the Second Battle of Moitara and how it weakened the Tuatha to the point they needed the help of the Milesians. He ponders out loud what would have happened if the Fomorians had won, talks about how the Shadow Realm is a place where hopes can become reality, and asks Kai if he's given up on resurrecting Lena. Kai says he hasn't lost his hopes of bringing her back, but that he realizes that the Shadow Realm is a hopeless place, and that he can't relive his past now that it has come and gone. Suddenly, Clive appears and apparently kills Fallon. We're confused, and Kikol appears to explain that the transmutation was a partial success, and that Clive has partially evolved. With that, he locks you in a barrier with it, and the final battle begins. Eventually, we chip the monster enough, and we get a cutscene of Kai and Lemur working together to break the top off of the barrier. We take the opportunity to call on Adniel with the horn he gave us, and he drops a meteor onto Clive, weakening it enough for us to finish it off. Once we strike the final blow, the walls fall and we reunite with Lemur, Kai, and Jenna. Just as it seems like things are finally over, Clive self-destructs and Lemur sacrifices himself to protect everyone. Kai, determined to make up for his betrayal and save his friend, uses alchemy to resurrect Lemur at the cost of his own life, and his body vanishes. The credits roll and we complete Generation 9 with what might just be the most excruciating cliffhanger in any generation. With the game's story out of the way, let's touch on some mythology. We'll start with Clive Solis, the Big Bad. The real-world Clive is a bit of a MacGuffin in folktales from both Ireland and Scotland. The sword seems to appear often in bridal tales, where the hero wins a beautiful or wealthy bride through a wager, but then must leave on a quest to find the sword due to some kind of pact. The name translates roughly to sword or glaive of light, and as far as I can tell, is not actually related to Nua in any meaningful way. Tethra, too, is a name borrowed from real-world myth. The mythical Tethra died in the Second Battle of Moitara and briefly ruled over Magmel. He was Fomorian, so Mabi got at least one thing right. Nua and Ela are super important figures, but I'll talk about them in later generations where they're more relevant to Mabinogi's story. Thank you so much for watching. I'm sorry this took as long as it did to finish. I've just had so many ideas for videos that I've been sort of in like a creative paralysis of not knowing what I wanted to push out next. If you're hungry for content between uploads, I stream here and at twitch.tv/interneteffigy almost every Friday, so please consider dropping in or following my Twitter @interneteffigy. If you like my content, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you're the first to know when a new video drops. Likes, comments, or even just sharing the video in your relevant communities, but please do not spam them, is super appreciated as well. I'll see you guys next time with a bit of a new style of video that's still very lore focused. But bye for now. Special thanks to my patrons Emmy Jen and Sunflares for all their support.